question to our panel of members. What's the trend of ppm? I mean, there are in regulations on both sides. There are limits on ppm and ppb, and what are the direction on both sides? Just a quick.
Well, the United States Congress has set our lead limits at 100 parts per million, and then the phthalates is 1,000 parts per million. But these are the two areas where Congress has set a content level. For the other metals, we have exposure rate that we set at the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And I'll let DeWane Ray comment any more. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, we at the federal level have that standard, but a lot of the states have decided on their own to go at much lower levels of those concentrations. Not quite, at least on the lead side, in the parts per billion level, but definitely down in the 40s on some of those that I think a lot of folks are aware of.
And we're seeing that lead, because there was so much literature on lead exposure, Congress felt very comfortable in setting a content level, 100 parts per million. But when we set the cadmium levels this year that were and sent that to the standards making bodies for children's jewelry and for toys, we still went to the exposure level. And I think that's where our trend is, Bernie, that we're going to stay with exposure levels unless there's an abundance of literature that allows you unequivocally to set a content level like Congress did for lead. But other than that, we still will have to set what exposure levels would harm a person, acute and chronic. We're still at looking at that level. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And from the EU?
Well, from the EU side, concerning the phthalates, we are at the same level as our US counterparts. However, concerning the chemical heavy elements that we call them, we have migration limits for 19 elements which are contained in the Toy Safety Directive, and some of them are very low. However, if we also have evidence that scientific reports have been published which can have an impact on those limits, we will have to revise and take them into account, and that's what happened, for example, with cadmium. The limits that we have are based on exposure and are based on tolerable daily intakes that a child is exposed to. And we have seen that for cadmium, the tolerable daily intake has changed, so that has an impact on the migration limits, for example, in the Toy Safety Directive. And we made a proposal for a decision to lower the limits, but it's only 2 ppm, depending on the kind of material, lower than the current values. But in future also, if new scientific evidence appears that there has been a change, for example, in the tolerable daily intake, of course, this will have an impact on our migration limits in the Toy Safety Directive.
Okay, sorry. So I'm ready to take more questions. Yeah, that's a very technical one. I should take off my jacket. Lots of heat from the floor, but these two groups are very good. I think the CPSC will answer this one.
This has to do with snappers, party poppers, etc., for such firework products which can be easily accessed by children, such as its packaging label for 8 years plus. Whether they are classified as children's products and required to follow CPSA regulations. Interestingly enough, we have just spent 3 days in Luoyang province meeting with fireworks manufacturers. And one of the issues that we talked about was adult snappers that have as much fire power as a firecracker. So we are very concerned about adult snappers in the United States that that you throw down and pop, but they have as much powder power as a firecracker, and we are looking at whether or not these should be banned. But these are snappers and party poppers. I don't think that they have, well, if it's a firework and it meets the definition of a firework, then it has to be labeled. And it would have to say that, you know, what it contains and what the affect of the product is when it's lit. But these are not children's products. We do not recognize any fireworks in the United States as children's products appropriate for children under 12. So this includes sparklers and any other fireworks. So it's really not a children's product. I know children, I did this when I was little and I was younger than 12. I played with sparklers, but it was with adult supervision. And it still is not labeled for children under 12, but children under 12 use sparklers.
Thank you. Thank you. I think next question, EU has a question on
the question is, will the EU consider phthalates requirement to be the same as in the US, meaning it's not applicable for inaccessible parts? I would like to refer to the HR 2715, if I'm correct, from the US, in which they say that it's possible to have phthalates in inaccessible parts. However, I would like to refer to our restrictions under the REACH regulation, and there we make a distinction between the phthalates. We have 3 phthalates which are classified as carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reprotoxic. So we know that those substances, those 3 phthalates, are dangerous, and that's why we do not accept them in inaccessible and accessible parts. Concerning the other 3, they are not classified. So for those 3, we do accept that they may be used in toys and childcare articles and intended to be placed in the mouth. I don't have the restriction here with me, but there we can make the distinction, but not for the 3 classified one. So I know it's a distinction with the US requirement.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think next question maybe for DeWane. Oh yeah, you have two to cover.
That's a very complicated.
Yeah.
Okay, I get the technical question here. The question is, are the materials listed in 16 CFR 1500.89 and 91, do the exemptions apply to the heavy metal migration requirements? So I'll start with that one. The exemptions that I was speaking to in our presentation had to do with the lead exemptions that were listed out there. So those were new exemptions that were applied. I'm not aware of any exemptions that exist for these sections as listed. Also, the question was, do paper and pure textile materials need to be tested for soluble heavy metals requirements? Under 963, there's no mention of that. 963.11. The Commission has put out documents, at least on the lead side, as far as exemptions for certain textiles and paper products that are known not to contain lead. While we haven't specifically addressed this issue, I think in general the way we would handle things like that is items that were known not to contain some of the materials, we wouldn't necessarily require a test to prove that they're not in there. But if I didn't answer that specifically, whoever asked that afterwards, I'd love to chat some more and get some more detail for you.
Thank you. Okay. And I think there is...
This is about, will there be any guidelines on accessibility for phthalates? It's written to DeWane Ray. Our CHAP, our Chronic Hazard Advisory Panel, is still meeting on the phthalates. Congress permanently banned 3, so you couldn't use 3 phthalates. They temporarily banned the other 3, and the CHAP is looking at whether or not they will permanently recommend banning it, as well as looking at other phthalates. Congress just amended the CPSIA and recognized that if phthalates are in an inaccessible part, then they could be exempt. because we've not finished the CHAP has not recommended anything on migration yet. So I'll let DeWane say if we expect to have guidelines on accessibility.
There's some, the short answer is right now we don't see an immediate need. There are specific there's specific language in the recent amendment that describes what is accessible and how it will be evaluated. So for the time being, I think the Commission staff's opinion would be that we would follow that direction. Now, if we find that that's not clear enough and there's gray area, like we've done on many other times, if a guidance document would be more helpful, we would go through the process to develop that. But I think for the time being, it's pretty specific in the revised regulations.
One thing that Bernie wanted to know is that we have a provision in the CPSIA that if the lead is inaccessible in the children's toy or children's product, then you do not have to test it's allowable. So we didn't have guidelines for that, did we? He wanted to know, would that be pertinent to phthalates too?
The concept of accessibility is the same, regardless of the exposure to whatever the chemical is. The concept of how a child would get access and exposure, the Commission would use the same criteria, and it's specified. But if there is, if we find that there's a need or desire for more information on that, we would definitely do that.
So you're talking about the probes, use of the probes to determine whether it's accessible. That would be relevant to phthalates as well, because we have not, there's been no report from the CHAP on migration and in the United States, so we would use the same method for determining accessibility with the probes as for lead and phthalates.
Thank you. I think, please, I think we can entertain, with this questions on hand, we can entertain two more, or two or three more. Please. Question.
So I've received two questions relating to the requirements in the EU directive regarding cleaning and washing of toys for children under 3. One example is a soft-filled toy intended for children under 3, which has a rattle inside. Now, the rattle is not an electronic part, but it could be damaged by soap washing. So the directive says if the toy contains a component that could be damaged, then the cleaning requirement applies and not the soap washing requirement. And therefore, if it contains a rattle that can be damaged, the soap washing requirement does not apply. So therefore, it would be okay to, for example, label it surface wash only. The other question is whether or not it's mandatory, according to the directive, to have a cleaning instruction on the packaging or on the toy when it comes to cleaning and washing. And since the guidance document states, if appropriate, and that's not very precise. Well, for one thing, you can read in the explanatory guide on the technical documentation where this is mentioned. Personally, I would see this as a way for the manufacturer to limit his responsibility, we could say. Because if there is no washing information, as I mentioned before, perhaps the consumer will then machine wash it in 90 degrees. But if the manufacturer has clearly stated that it's only to be hand washed in 30 degrees, then he has told the consumer that he does not accept responsibility for the safety of the toy if that instruction is violated. And this is why I think the directive or the guidance document mentions, if appropriate. It's up to the manufacturer to decide whether he wants to limit the way the consumer can clean or wash the product.
Simple one.
It's a very simple one, I agree. Is the safety assessment procedure documented as a guidance document, and is it available on the European website? So the details given by Mr. Wetterberg are indeed contained in the technical documentation guidance document, which is available on the European Commission's website under the toys unit. You had the link in my presentation. Please consult that one. You will find all our guidance documents. At the bottom, you will find the technical documentation guidance document. There's a drop-out menu to see all the languages. Amongst all the languages, you will find the Chinese version. So it is available with the details on the chemical safety assessment, also on the mechanical, physical, electrical, and flammability assessment, and the hygiene and radioactivity assessment.
Okay, so actually next question is for me. Simple one also. Will I be possible to have a copy of your presentation and put on our website? Okay. And then US will do the same. I think. Thank you for both. They are on a busy traveling schedule. It will be difficult to. Now I can get their presentation on our website. I think also for Hong Kong Toy Council, we will consolidate both, and maybe in a few months' time, do a CMD, another seminar on these two to educate our member, and also together with our CMD and the computerized program risk assessment. Okay. Next one is.
I got one.
You got one, yeah.
This question, as specified in the exemption list of lead test, fabric is not considered as a barrier to accessibility. Thus, the material under the layer of the fabric is needed to consider the lead test. In case if a component is covered by 2 layers of fabric, which the accessibility is significantly reduced, will that said component be considered as inaccessible? I think the answer is, or the question is, can you pile a whole bunch of fabric up and it suddenly becomes inaccessible? The answer is no. Unfortunately, we've ruled fabric is not an appropriate barrier for accessibility. So the short answer is no.
Thank you. Okay, that's maybe one more question.
This says, is there any requirement compliance need to follow for the packaging of the toys? On the presentation, more focus on the toys itself, especially on the paper, printing materials, packaging materials. So I'll let you answer that, DeWane. I don't know that.
Yeah, no problem. There are specific requirements both in the CFRs, the Code of Federal Regulations, on labeling instructions, and also in the toy standard there are restrictions as far as labeling toys. If you want to get specific, I'll be glad to share those sites with you after the presentation instead of rambling them off here.
Okay. I think that's all the question. Before we go, I have one more. Or is there another one? Okay. I'll try to read this because it's for both. I think it is for both small parts. A tiny point marking needs to perform total lead content total content test, and most lab needs a big quantity of samples to perform the test. This small amount of paint require small point can be exempt from the chemical test. Maybe U.S. go first, or I think exactly.
What did she say?
Okay, I'll
it's about how many. When you look at the finished product and you have to destroy your product to test. It's very expensive. I think this is where this is going. So we passed a voluntary rule on component parts that if you can buy paint already certified and already has the certificate, you can use that paint. So as many materials as you can purchase that are already certified before you manufacture, then you don't have to destroy the finished product. And this is we're hopeful that the component part industry will develop so that you don't have to totally destroy a finished product when you know the components already are make the product compliant.
Yeah. Okay.
But it is, and you have to have a representative sample when you continuously test, so that we leave to the manufacturer to let us know how many products are in your sample to guarantee that you are compliant with all the rest of the products that have not been tested. And that is industry. We let the industry decide how many samples you need to test. We don't try to tell you 20 out of a batch of 100.
Yeah.
We let the industry, based on your component parts, whether you have component parts and certification, and whether you can assure compliance based on the number you test, that the rest of them in the batch are compliant.
I think that's key. Total content, and then work with qualified labs, and those are two key things. Yeah, and then I think both EU and US do list their qualified labs. Same for China. China do have their qualified labs, and if you don't know, in Hong Kong, I think you can ask the Hong Kong AS. They do also have a list. I think in certain way they are all somewhat overlap, and find a qualified lab and they should be able to answer. I think we have friends from Japan. Also, they do have their qualified labs listed also. Yeah, thank you. And if there's no further question, we'll wrap up today's meeting. Very technical, and we can take more hit next time also.
Thank you.
Thank you.